The small piglet trembled in her arms, a warm, living weight against the worn fabric of her dress. Around her, the town of Prosperity Flats held its breath, watching. They stood in silent, judgmental clusters outside the general store, near the blacksmith's forge, their faces hard and unyielding in the sharp afternoon light. Abigail felt their stares like a physical pressure, a cold weight that settled in her bones, heavier than the grief she already carried. She was an island, and the sea of their disapproval was rising. The dust kicked up by her worn boots was the only thing that dared to move between her and them. Marshall Thompson, a man whose authority was as starched as his collar, strode toward her, his shadow arriving long before he did. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze flicking from her face to the squirming animal in her arms, then to the ugly, gaping hole she had spent the last 2 months digging at the edge of her property. It was a raw wound in the earth, a testament to back-breaking labor and a promise she refused to break. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense quiet. "Abigail," he began, his voice laced with a patronizing certainty, "the council has met. This a project of yours. It is a public nuisance. It is an eyesore. And frankly, it is unsettling the community." He gestured vaguely toward the silent watchers, as if they were a jury that had already delivered its verdict. She simply held the piglet closer, feeling its tiny heart beat against her palm. This was all she had left of the plan, the last piece of a future sketched out in quiet whispers with her late husband. They saw a madwoman digging a pit, she saw the only path forward. Her husband, Henry, had been a quiet man, a reader of almanacs and a watcher of the sky. He had come from a place farther east, a land where winters were not merely inconvenient, but were cruel, hungry beasts that could swallow a whole season of hope. He saw things the people of Prosperity Flats, with their sun-baked confidence and their history of mild seasons, had long forgotten. "The creeks are running low, but the squirrels are hoarding twice the nuts," he told her one evening, his finger tracing a line on a frosted window pane. "The bark on the north side of the oaks is thicker than I've ever seen. Nature is preparing for a fight." Abigail, the townsfolk, content with their sturdy above-ground barns and their healthy herds grazing in open pasture, had dismissed his concerns as the ramblings of an outsider. They trusted what they could see, a wide-open sky, endless grass, and a long, gentle autumn. Henry had planned to build a shelter for their animals, a dugout sunk deep into the earth, insulated by the very soil that the others took for granted. A place where the killing cold could not reach. But a fever had taken him before he could lift the first shovel, leaving Abigail with nothing but the blueprint of his wisdom and a deep, unshakable premonition. So when she sold off most of their meager belongings to buy a small herd of breeding pigs, the town saw it as a widow's folly. And when she began to dig, they saw it as her descent into madness. Marshall Thompson had voiced their collective opinion. "There's no need for such extremes," he had told her. "Our barns have stood for 50 years." She had looked him straight in the eye, her hands raw from the shovel, her voice low but steady. "A hard winter doesn't ask permission, Marshall. It just arrives." That line, spoken in the dust and the sun, became a prophecy they would all come to remember. The work was a brutal meditation. Each morning, before the sun had burned the chill from the air, she was in the pit. The shovel became an extension of her arms. The pickaxe, a tool to shatter the stubborn layers of rock and clay, became the sound of her grief being broken apart, piece by piece. First, she moved the dark, rich topsoil, piling it neatly to one side. This would later be spread over the roof, a living blanket that would grow grass in the spring. Then came the dense, red clay, heavy and wet. It stuck to the shovel, making every load a battle of leverage and will. Her back screamed in protest. Blisters formed on her palms, broke, and hardened into thick calluses. She was not a large woman, and the sheer volume of earth she had to move seemed impossible. But Henry's voice was a constant presence in her mind, guiding her. "Angle the ramp just so, for the animals to walk down without fear. Dig a sump in the corner, a place for the wet to gather so they stay dry. The roof needs to be thick, at least 3 feet of earth to keep the frost out." So she dug. Day after day, week after week. The town's mockery was a distant hum, drowned out by the scrape of steel on stone and the rhythmic thud of her own heart. She lined the earthen walls with flat stones she hauled from the creek bed, fitting them together like a vast, irregular puzzle. This wasn't just a hole in the ground, it was a feat of intuitive engineering. She devised a narrow ventilation shaft, screened with wire mesh, to allow stale air out without letting the cold in. The entrance was a long, sloping ramp, wide enough for a sow to pass comfortably, with a heavy, plank-reinforced door at the bottom. The town saw a woman digging her own grave. She was building an ark. By the time the last of the autumn leaves had fallen, the dugout was complete. From a distance, it looked like a low, unnatural mound of earth, a scar on the otherwise flat landscape. The townsfolk gave it a name. The widow's pit. Their children, emboldened by their parents' scorn, would sometimes creep to the edge of her property and toss pebbles onto the earthen roof, their laughter sharp and cruel on the wind. Abigail ignored them. She spent a week moving her small herd of pigs, one large sow, a young boar, and a handful of growing show-ots, into their new home. They squealed with uncertainty at first, sniffing the damp, dark air of the ramp. But inside, on a thick bed of dry straw, protected from the biting wind, they settled quickly. The ambient temperature of the earth kept the space from freezing, creating a stable, secure environment. Marshall Thompson paid her one final visit, his face a mask of weary disapproval. "Abigail, for the last time," he said, standing at the top of the ramp and peering down into the dim light. "This is no way to raise livestock. They need sunlight. Fresh air." He looked at her small, sturdy cabin, then back at the mound. "Whatever you think is coming, you are mistaken. You're isolating yourself for nothing." He left, shaking his head, convinced of her delusion. That night, the first sign appeared. It wasn't a storm, not yet. It was a change in the quality of the silence. The air grew still and heavy, holding a crystalline cold that felt sharp in the lungs. The sky, which had been a brilliant, cloudless blue for weeks, took on a milky, hazy quality. A single, perfect snowflake drifted down and landed on her sleeve. It did not melt. She looked up at the bruised purple horizon and knew. It was here. The snow began not as a flurry, but as a quiet, determined siege. Fine, granular flakes started to fall, coating the world in a thin layer of white. The people of Prosperity Flats welcomed it, a picturesque start to the winter. They lit their fires, confident in their well-stocked larders and their sturdy wooden barns. But the snow did not stop. By the second day, it had become a blinding, horizontal blizzard, driven by a wind that shrieked like a banshee. Visibility dropped to zero. The world beyond their windows ceased to exist, replaced by a swirling vortex of white. Drifts began to pile up against doors and walls, burying fences and erasing roads. Inside her small cabin, Abigail was calm. A low fire crackled in her hearth. The wind howled outside, but her home was tight and warm. Every hour, she would bundle herself in heavy wool and make the short, protected journey to the dugout. She'd unlatch the heavy door and descend the ramp into a different world. Down there, the storm was just a muffled roar. The pigs were content, snuffling in their clean straw, warmed by each other's bodies and the insulating embrace of the earth. The temperature in the dugout held steady, far above freezing, a stark contrast to the lethal cold that was tightening its grip on the world above. She would check their food and water, the scent of warm animals and clean earth a comfort against the storm's fury. She knew what was happening in the town's barns. She could almost hear it, the groan of wood under the immense weight of the snow, the panicked, desperate cries of cattle and sheep trapped in the suffocating cold, the slow, inexorable creep of frost that would steal the breath from their lungs. They had built their security on the surface, exposed to the sky. They had forgotten the power of the earth beneath their feet. The blizzard raged for 8 straight days. When it finally broke, the world was unrecognizable. Prosperity Flats was buried under a silent, monolithic blanket of white. The sun emerged, glinting off a landscape that was both beautiful and terrifying. The silence that followed the storm was worse than the howling wind had been. It was a dead quiet, punctuated by the sharp crack of freezing wood and the mournful creak of signs swinging in the frigid air. The men of the town dug themselves out, their faces grim. The first thing they did was check their livestock. The scene was one of uniform devastation. Barn roofs had collapsed under the sheer weight of the snow, crushing the animals within. Those in structures that had held were no better off. The cattle and sheep had frozen to death where they stood, solid statues in the lethal cold. The town's entire stock of four-legged wealth, their source of meat, milk, and leather, was gone. Marshall Thompson stood numbly before the ruins of his own barn, the carcasses of his prize-winning herd visible beneath the splintered timbers. The pride of the county, gone. A collective wave of shock, then dawning horror, swept through the community. Their larders, which had seemed so full, were now finite. The preserved meats and salted fish would not last forever. The general store supplies were already being rationed. The hunters' paths were impassable, buried under 10 feet of snow. They were isolated, cut off, and their primary source of winter protein had been wiped out in a single, brutal stroke. Hope began to curdle into fear. The cold was no longer just an inconvenience, it was a predator, and it had just stolen their future. They were trapped, and they were beginning to starve. Inside the town hall, the air was thick with despair. The council sat around a long table, their faces pale in the lantern light. The initial shock had given way to a frantic, desperate accounting. They counted barrels of flour, sacks of beans, jars of preserves. The numbers were stark. At the current ration, they had maybe 3 weeks before the food ran out entirely. Children were already crying from hunger, their small bodies ill-equipped to handle the gnawing emptiness. "We can't get a message out," one man said, his voice hollow. "The pass is buried. It'll be months before anyone can get through." A panic began to fray the edges of civility. Accusations were whispered. Blame was a hot coal being passed from hand to hand. And then, in the middle of the grim silence, a new thought emerged, spoken first by Finn, the general store owner's quiet son. He was barely a man, and he had been one of the few who had watched Abigail's digging with more curiosity than contempt. "What about the widow?" he asked. The name fell into the room like a stone. Abigail. The woman with the pit. The madwoman. The council members looked at each other. The thought was absurd, and yet, her project, the thing they had mocked, was built to defy this very disaster. Her livestock was underground. Protected. Insulated. While their wealth froze in their state-of-the-art barns, her humble pigs might have survived. It was a sliver of hope so thin it was almost painful. The marshal, his face etched with a humility he had never before known, looked at the boy. "Someone has to go," he said, his voice raspy. "Someone has to see." All eyes turned to Finn. He was young, strong, and carried less of the shame of their collective mockery. He nodded, accepting the burden. The journey would be treacherous, but it was the only path left. Prosperity Flats, a town named for its confidence, was now betting its survival on the woman it had cast out. Finn's journey was a battle against a transformed world. He moved on snowshoes, sinking with every step into the deep, powdery drifts. The familiar landscape was gone, replaced by a rolling sea of white that hid landmarks and filled ravines. The cold was a physical entity, stealing the breath and burning the skin. It took him half a day to cover the distance he could normally walk in an hour. When he finally crested the last rise and saw Abigail's property, he stopped, his heart pounding. Her small cabin stood intact, a plume of smoke rising steadily from its chimney, a defiant signal of life. And next to it, the mound. The widow's pit. It was not buried. A gentle slope on its windward side had caused the snow to drift around it, leaving the entrance and the ventilation shaft clear. Steam rose from the shaft, melting the snow around its edges, a sign of the warmth and life held within the earth. He stumbled down the slope, his legs trembling with exhaustion and cold. He knocked on the cabin door, the sound swallowed by the immense silence. The door opened. Abigail stood there, her expression unreadable. She was not surprised to see him. She simply looked at his frost-rimmed face and the desperation in his eyes, and stepped aside. "Come in before you freeze," she said, her voice calm and even. She gave him a hot cup of broth, and he drank it so fast he burned his tongue. He didn't care. The warmth spread through him like a prayer. Finally, he found his voice, the words tumbling out in a rush, the blizzard, the collapsed barns, the dead cattle, the hunger. He delivered the town's desperate plea, his voice cracking with the shame of it. "We were wrong," he finished, his eyes fixed on the floor. "We need your help. We're starving." Abigail listened without a word, her gaze steady. She looked out the window, toward the buried town, then back at him. "Help is not a gift, Finn," she said softly, but with a spine of steel. "It is a lesson. You can have the meat, but the town will earn it." The next morning, a small procession of men, led by Marshal Thompson, made their way to Abigail's homestead. They were a somber, humbled crew, their former arrogance stripped away by cold and hunger. When they arrived, Abigail was waiting for them, not at her cabin, but at the top of the ramp to the dugout. She led them down into the earthy warmth. The sight that met them silenced any remaining vestiges of their pride. In the clean, straw-filled enclosure, the pigs were thriving. The sow had recently given birth, and a dozen healthy piglets squealed and tumbled over one another, a picture of vibrant life. In a world that had frozen to death, here was a pocket of impossible warmth and abundance. The men stared, their faces a mixture of awe and profound shame. This pit they had mocked, this folly, was a marvel of foresight and resilience. "My husband taught me that a person's real wealth isn't what they show off," Abigail said, her voice echoing softly in the enclosed space. "It's what they prepare for in secret." She laid out her terms, her voice firm and clear. She would provide the pork to feed the town. But they would not be given handouts. They would work. Every man would take a turn. They would help her with the butchering, the salting, the smoking. They would learn the skills they had grown too comfortable to value. And they would help her haul the supplies needed to maintain the dugout and care for the remaining animals. It was not a punishment, but a restoration of balance. They were to be partners in their own salvation. Marshal Thompson, his face haggard, stepped forward. He looked at Abigail, then at the healthy animals, then at the faces of his men. "We accept," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of his error. "And we are in your debt." He then turned to face her fully, his gaze unwavering. "We were wrong, Abigail. We were proud and foolish. And we are sorry." The work began immediately. The dugout, once a site of private labor and public scorn, became the heart of the town's survival. Abigail was no longer the outcast widow, she was the quartermaster, the teacher, the quiet authority they had desperately needed. She directed the men with an efficiency that left them in awe. They, who had run a town and managed large herds, now took instruction from a woman they had dismissed. She showed them how to be quick and humane, how to waste nothing. The hide, the bones, the fat, every part had a purpose. The men, clumsy at first, learned quickly, their hunger a sharp and motivating tutor. They built a makeshift smokehouse near the dugout, following her design. They hauled snow to be melted for water. They chopped wood for the smoking fires. They worked in shifts, their shared labor forging a new kind of community, one born not of pride, but of shared vulnerability and purpose. The first distribution of meat in Prosperity Flats was a solemn affair. Families received their ration not as charity, but as the fruit of their collective effort. The taste of fresh pork was the taste of hope, a promise that they would see the spring. As the weeks went on, the rhythm of survival took hold. The town was no longer starving. But more than that, a profound shift had occurred. The men who worked alongside Abigail saw the intelligence and strength they had been blind to. They saw the calluses on her hands and understood, for the first time, the true cost of her foresight. The laughter of their children, once used to mock her, was now heard again in the streets because of her. They had called her home the widow's pit. They now had a new name for it, the larder. It was a place of life, a testament to the quiet wisdom they had once been too proud to hear. The lesson was being learned, not in words, but in the humbling, essential work of staying alive. In the evenings, the marshal would often just stand there, watching the smoke rise from the smokehouse, a silent monument to their folly and their salvation.